The Do No Harm project started 16 years ago. It grew out of experiences that Mary Anderson, who is my former executive director, she just retired, and we have a new executive director at CDA as of February 1st, a man named Steve Darville. Mary was doing some work with UNHCR at the time on gender, and she was visiting a lot of refugee camps in the early 90s. And she heard the same stories again and again as she was visiting them. And she heard the same stories in Sri Lanka, in Tajikistan, in Afghanistan, in Guatemala, in Bosnia. People were saying, we're doing good work. We're helping these people who need to be helped. But we also see that our resources are being misused by people over here. That the conflict actually is getting worse in places. So we're helping these people, but we're actually making life worse for these people, just by the way in which we're bringing resources into a place. And any time you go into a place with those resources, people will try to make use of them. And so that was one of the challenges that people were seeing in the early 90s. And they said, we really should try to learn something about this. So Mary started a project. It's called the Local Capacities for Peace Project at that time, but very quickly was changed to Do No Harm, as a doctor said to us. This is first principle of humanitarian ethics. Do no harm, just as it is medical ethics. So we changed the name of the project. It's kind of catchy. As she looked at these things, and then as we gathered people together in this project, and the way that we work is collaborative learning projects. That's the name of my organization, CDA Collaborative Learning Projects. Collaborative learning projects, where we bring people together from lots of organizations. We have a theory that the more brains you put on a question, the better your answers will be. So we brought together lots of people to talk about this. What is your experience in this conflict zone? What is happening? How are you interacting with the conflict? How do you see your resources being misused? Where do you actually see options? How have you come up with new ideas in that situation? So the project went through a learning phase, and these projects always go through a process of learning some lessons and then trying to apply those lessons out into the field. And so in the process of learning, we came up with a framework. And that framework then has been taken out by people into the field. And then the connection to lenses will all become clear. This framework is often referred to by people as a lens through which they see their work. Very quickly, let me tell you the lessons that we learned in this project. The first lesson is you are a part of the context. Even if you're coming from outside with whatever intervention, whatever assistance, once you're there, you're a part of it. The context and you are having impacts on each other. It's not just about risk, and we have people talking about risk assessment also in this conference. The next session in this room, in fact, is on risk assessment. It's not just about risk to you, but it's also the fact that you're having an impact on that context. Should not be a controversial text. Shall not be not just about text. Shall not be to you. Shall text. The fact shall not be shall text having an impact. Shall not be on that shall text. Shall not be shall be controversial. Not just about to you. So the fact having an impact on that text. A controversial. Not just about to you. So the fact having an impact on that text. A controversial. Not just about to you. So the fact having an impact on that text. A controversial. Not just about to you. So the fact. The third lesson was that when you go into a situation, you have an impact on both. If you go into a context, you have an impact on the context, not just the context, but you have an impact on the dividers and the connectors. The reason for the Do No Harm project was people were seeing the negative impacts. They were seeing that they were having an impact on the dividers of increasing them, making them worse, and also that they're having an impact on connectors, of undermining them, of cutting them down, of not supporting them. And people said that was equally damaging. Yes, you make the dividers worse, the tension level goes up, the conflict can get worse. But if you undermine the connectors, you make peace more difficult. Conflict should come to an end, and almost always does come to an end, but if there's no foundation for peace, it's very difficult to reach that end point, and very difficult, even if you do reach that end point, to rebuild after that. So undermining connectors was seen as very dangerous. The other lesson here is that you can have a positive impact. You can have a mitigating effect on dividers. You can actually reduce dividers through the way in which you do your work. And you can support connectors. You can find ways to actually bolster them. The fourth lesson was that it was your resources that have an impact. Charity organizations, humanitarian development organizations aren't rushing into places that are well off, usually. They're not rushing into places where there's a surplus of resources. We're going into places where there's a surfeit of resources. People will always try to make use of that in that situation. Political authorities are very clever at increasing legitimacy through resources. That's one thing. If it's a legitimate authority and you want to support that, that's a good thing. If they're not a legitimate authority, you don't wish to support them, that's a difficult thing. If it's a rebel militia in an area, you may not want to support them, depending on who they are. We also see that resources they tend to go to losers as opposed to winners in a conflict. And if you're giving the resources to the losers, the winners who also have needs at the end of a conflict, everyone has needs, the winners will say, well, why do they get to benefit? Is the international community on their side? Are they just having a little pause in the war to rearm and then they'll come back and attack us after the international community has rebuilt them? We see that this dynamic plays out again and again in situations with winners and losers. Losers get the resources, the winners attack them again because they see the resources coming in. So the resources have an impact. The fifth lesson was that the messages have an impact. It's not just what we're doing, it's how we do it. Our behavior, our interaction with individuals on a daily basis, our interaction as organizations with groups of people, those have an impact. We call them the implicit ethical messages in the Do No Harm Project because people actually see them as ethical, and they're implicit because we don't necessarily recognize that we're sending these messages to people. Both the resources and the messages play out in predictable ways. There are patterns that repeat that we've seen again and again. The sixth lesson was that the details matter. It's not a whole program or project that's having a negative impact or a positive impact. It's some choice that you've made. Every project is a whole series of decisions and choices that we've made over time. And it's certain details in that that matter. The seventh and last lesson is that there are always options. You can always do things differently than you've done it before. You can meet the same needs in 1,000 different ways. You don't always have to do things the exact same way that you've always done them. If it worked in one country, you can't assume it's going to work that way in another country. If it's worked in one neighborhood, you can't assume it will work the same way in another neighborhood. But you can still meet the same needs in those places. You can still find ways to do it. Those are the 7 lessons that the Do No Harm Project learned. Created a framework out of those 7 lessons. This is our lens. Everyone now is supposed to look at the world through that lens. Just to say that this captures those relationships within those 7 lessons and does provide a series of steps by which people can start thinking more closely about their assistance and its impact on dividers and connectors in a situation. People in the field don't use this. People like it when it gets explained to them. They say it's nice, it captures the relationships, but that it's not usable. As I said, all of our projects, we try to learn some lessons and then we try to capture them into a tool that will be taken out practically and be used by people. People said, as we were developing this, and this did not just come out of CDA, this came out of the experience of hundreds of organizations, thousands of people involved in it, saying what's important, what's the information we need to know, how do we need to put that information, how do we organize that information so that we can make use of it. That's what this is. This is that collaborative effort of saying, what do we need to know? How do we organize it so that we understand it? And then when people took it out into the field, they don't actually use it this way. But they do use do no harm. And they do make good decisions. For the past 3 years, I've been actually traveling around the world talking to people involved in the Do No Harm project, many of whom have been involved for 15 years, some of whom have been involved for as little as 6 months, but saying, how do you use this? You say you're doing do no harm. What does that mean if you tell me also in the same breath you're not doing this? And they said that what they do is they think about dividers and connectors. The whole rest of that framework, they ignore dividers and connectors. So the question is why? Why did people say all of this other stuff was necessary, but now they come down to use this? And in exploring this with people, we come back to the idea of the lens. That whole framework is what people call the lens of do no harm. The lens is a metaphor that's supposed to help guide us and to focus us. We have a conflict sensitivity lens. We have a do no harm lens. We look at the world that way. We think of lenses. Lots of us here in this room wear glasses. Some of us may wear contacts as well, but you put the glasses on and you see everything more clearly. And that's where this metaphor comes from, is we put on our do no harm glasses and we're supposed to see everything more clearly. It turns out that's not the case. If people try to wear the do no harm lens, that full framework, they say they don't see the world more clearly. They say that they're overwhelmed by the amount of information they need to gather, that they are confused by the steps within it, and whether or not you should be doing certain things in a certain order. Now, we've tried to be very responsive to that and looking at the way people have used it and say, well, you don't have to follow the steps the way that we've laid it out in our publications, and I've written several documents trying to say you could start here and this is what that means, and you could start here and this is what that means. Doesn't matter. When it all boils down to it, people use dividers and connectors. It's not that the other information isn't useful, and the really sophisticated do no harm users will make use of some of those other things. But their decisions are not any better than the ones made by people who only use dividers and connectors. Now, the positive spin on this, actually, is that people who use dividers and connectors, who think about a context in terms of what divides people, what connects people, make great decisions. It's changed the decision-making process in many organizations about what they're going to do. So this works. But the lens of do no harm, people still get caught up in that. How do we take a principle like do no harm or gender awareness and actually make use of it? What we see is people cut away everything that they say doesn't necessarily help them. And so I've started to think in the metaphor not of a lens, but of a filter. What's the minimum amount of information you need to actually make use of the lens? What's the minimum amount of information you need to make a better decision, a better choice in a project? And in the context of do no harm, people have said dividers and connectors. For thinking about conflict issues, that if we come up with dividers and connectors and think about those, generate a couple of lists here, that we can actually make better decisions. One of the key things that people say about this as they talk about dividers and connectors is change over time as well. You don't just look at a static list of dividers or connectors in a situation, you track the changes. And the people who make good decisions are the ones who are saying, okay, I have seen how this is changing, and I see my relationship to it. So they say they get rid of it all, although standing in the middle of it, the assistance program really is still there, though people don't necessarily do the process, a formal process, with the assistance program of actually looking at the details of it. So those dividers and connectors, you make those lists and you track change over time, and people start making better decisions. They filter out all of the other information. If you're thinking about a context of conflict, there are an infinite number of things that you could be looking at. or a nearly infinite number. You could delve into root causes of the conflict. You could delve into root causes village by village by village. And sometimes people have said, actually, it's really important to know the family relationship in that village. But most of the time, it's not. But if you're in the context, you know that it's important right there. That's a divider that matters. It's contextual knowledge. And when people do this as well, they come up with short lists of dividers and connectors. If you sit down and think about the place where you are working right now, and if you sit down with a couple of your teammates, people in your organization also working in that area, and you come up with a list of dividers and connectors, you will come up with healthy long lists of 25 or 50 or 150 things if you take it seriously. But you don't need that many. If you think about prioritizing those lists, they tend to boil down to about 6 of each. This is really interesting to me. People in conflict situations, the most complex and dynamic situations that is possible to live in, say all we need to know really are about 6 dividers and 6 connectors, and we can make really good decisions. They're filtering information. They're cutting it down. They're cutting out everything they don't need. And this is why, as I say, I'm thinking in the metaphor of a filter now, that dividers and connectors is a filter. I think that this can be applied to other lenses, where we find people who are effectively using lenses. What is the information that they really are using? What is the information they really care about? If we find somebody who is effectively using gender as a lens, what does that really mean? What is the information that they're using? I'm actually going to provide a little answer to that from one experience. A friend of mine was working in Indonesia, and when I went out to visit him, his staff all told me the same story because they wanted me to understand how much they respected what he had taught them. And it was a gender-related story of him going to a village where they were doing a water project and talking to the men in the village, sitting down with them in the hut where they were getting, you had the elders come to have that conversation, and he talked to them, and they determined where the water point should be and where the pipes should be laid and whose land, and et cetera, et cetera. And at the end of that, he said, "What are the women doing?" And the men said, "Well, we think they're doing the washing today. We think they're down at the river." And he said, "Let's go talk to them." So they went down to the river, down a hill to the river, and he took his shoes off, rolled up his pants, and waded out to the women and stood around and talked to the women about water and how they would want it used and where they would think that the pipes should go and where the water points should be and all of the uses that they made of it. What he was doing was he was finding out what are the activities around water in this village. How do men use water? How do women use water? They both use water. They used it differently. And the men sat there on the bank and watched this process. And he never told the women what the men had decided. He just was asking them for their input on it. And eventually the village came to a synthesis of the women's perspective and the man's perspective. And that was all boiled down to the activities. I'm not going to say that's the perfect gender tool of looking at activities. What do men do? What do women do with this item? But that is a way in. And some more research would be necessary to actually figure out what are people who are good at gender analysis and gender awareness, what are they actually doing in that case? Because I'm sure there's an analog to this, dividers and connectors. I'm sure there's an analog across a whole range of these cross-cutting issues. The people who are good at this are cutting out a lot of information in this situation. On that issue of legitimacy of government, I am actually, want to bring this up, is I'm working with a ministry in the Afghan government on do no harm and do no harm practice, and really on dividers and connectors in the provinces where they work. I'm working with the Ministry of Rural Rehabilitation and Development. They are the only ministry in the country that actually has projects in every single district across the country. Afghanistan has, oh, I'm going to get this wrong, 34 provinces, and then each province is broken into districts. Some districts are places where where people will tell you, you cannot go there. And yet this ministry has a project, at least one project in every district of the country. So they are getting access to places that other ministries cannot get to. The Ministry of Education can't get to every district. The Ministry of Women definitely can't get to every district. But the Ministry of Rural Rehabilitation and Development can. And they see part of that is because their minister is one of the very first do no harm people. He organized the very first do no harm workshop ever. Way back in 1994, before there was even really a project to organize a workshop around. But he said you can't understand conflict and assistance unless you come to Afghanistan. So that's where we went, was there. And they do think about these issues, and I'm working with them because their staff don't necessarily know about this thinking process. The leadership knows. And this brings us back to how do people actually take things that they are good at in practice and they've stopped thinking about it? How do they actually transfer it out to the rest of their staff? And so they've been inviting me there every 3 months to actually work with the staff, to put them through workshops on this. But that's this process of saying, what do they need to know? And I can show them the whole framework. But typically what I like to do is just say, here are these categories. And then you have to put yourself into it. You don't stand apart from it because you are a part of the context. You actually stand in between them and you say, how am I having an impact on these? Which leads me to the final 2 stories that I want to tell you. And we'll open this up for some questions. Actual practice, actual taking do no harm and dividers and connectors into practice. 2 stories about how people have done that. In Nepal, one organization decided that they would have everybody think about their context, and they would think about dividers and connectors, that they would think about their context once a month for 20 minutes. And it was an organization that had projects in all 75 provinces of Nepal, and once a month, the headquarters in Kathmandu would send out 4 questions about the context to each office, same 4 questions, and everyone in those offices was required to be in that office on Friday afternoon for 20 minutes to talk about those 4 questions and to answer them based upon what they had seen the last month. And they talked about dividers and connectors in those meetings because those questions would focus on dividers and connectors. That information then was immediately sent back to the headquarters in Kathmandu, who produced a report over the weekend that Monday would be sent back out so that everybody on Monday morning could see the aggregate understanding of the context of Nepal. They found that they had a better understanding of the movements of the Maoist troops and the government troops than anyone, including the government or the Maoists, when they would interact with them in other places. They would know where stuff was happening, and they would start to predict where conflict was going to break out. They'd say, if the Maoists are here and the government is here and they're moving in this direction, then this province, and they would say that to the people in that province, you have to watch out. What are you going to do when the fighting breaks out? Are you prepared? Do you have the right resources to actually deal with a conflict? And maybe alert the other NGOs in the area that something's about to happen. And they were right. They were right, more often than not, that something would happen. 20 minutes a month. When it first started, people said, I don't have 20 minutes to spare for this. After they did it a few months, everyone looked forward to it. 20 minutes a month. They actually learned a phenomenal amount. The other practice story comes from an organization, local organization, Ugandan organization in Kampala that works in one slum, really small area that they're working in. And yet they use do no harm and they think about dividers and connectors. But the thing that they do every day with each other, and I've seen them do this, and they weren't just doing it because I'm the do no harm guy. They did this before they knew I was the do no harm guy in front of me. They ask each other all the time, are you going to do harm today? somebody says, this is what I'm going to go do today. This is my daily plan. And somebody says, you're going to cause harm. Inevitably. They describe their process of what I'm doing today, and somebody says, are you going to cause harm? They do it in a loving and joking way. Everyone laughs. And they step back and they think. And they talk about the changes and decisions that they've made just by having somebody ask them that question. One woman was going off to the marketplace to buy some goods that they were going to use as sort of a bribe to get teachers to come to a parent-teachers meeting. They were going to give mosquito nets and jerry cans and blankets to parents who came. And so she described what she was going to do, and her boss said, are you going to cause harm? And she thought about it. She said, I don't think so. She gets to the marketplace. She looks at the prices on the things. The mosquito nets cost 4 times as much as the blankets and the jerry cans. And she realized, if I buy mosquito nets and we give those to some families, but only blankets to another, that creates conflict between those families. And if we give it to the mosquito nets to people from one ethnic group in our slum, and we have 50 in this slum, and we give the blankets to people from another, that's not just those families, that's those groups. So she didn't buy the mosquito nets. She just bought the blankets and the jerry cans, made sure that she had items of equal value to hand out to the parents. But that was because in her head, just as she was heading off to the market, she'd been asked, are you going to cause harm? Very simple little thing. And yet she knows what the dividers are in that slum because she lives there. She spends all of her time there. She knows what the divisions are, and she knows that if she does certain things, she will feed into them. She also knows what the connectors are. The reason they wanted to bribe people to come to the parent-teachers meeting is because they know that if they get those parents involved in the kids' education, that changes the nature of the relationship of the school, the children, and those parents to each other across groups. So she also understood what the connectors were in that situation. And she didn't want to undermine those, and she didn't want to support the dividers. So it's not necessarily about applying the lens of our values to our work. It's about applying the filter of our values. What's the minimum amount that we need to know in order to make good decisions based upon our principles and our values? Thank you very much.